Hi guys, so I just want to make a video responding to Sargon, who, is still on the streak of bashing China. And this is just, it's almost kind of silly because he doesn't seem to realize that he's just basically following what the mainstream media has been saying, and he's been countering the mainstream media for most of his career. But when it comes to China, it's just like everything they say must be correct because he's just absolutely convinced. It doesn't even seem to register in his mind that, well, maybe the Western media is going on the smear campaign against China about a lot of these things. Now, I'm not going to say that everything mainstream media says about China is false. I mean, obviously not. I've said this before, and I think I need people to understand, which is that China is not a Western nation. It's still a developing nation to many perspectives. I mean, it was hundreds of years behind. If you just think about Western nations, if you think about, Britain, for example, from when they developed the liberal democratic idea, the Western idea, from John Locke, from John Stuart Mill, to where they are today, it took hundreds of years. And these are the hundreds of years that China is trying to catch up. So obviously they're going to stumble and fall. They're going to be, a bunch of stuff like authoritarianism. They're going to fuck up a lot, and they're going to be issues. And I'm certainly not saying that you shouldn't criticize them. I'm simply saying that you need to take context into consideration, and it really annoys me that Sargon isn't doing that. And in addition, what's even more annoying to me is that he seems to have basically abandoned his principle of talking to people on different sides about this. He's been covering China a lot, but it just doesn't seem like he's actually interested. He's covering the topic that he's really not that interested. Because he's not talking to anybody about it. He should be talking to people like Nathan Rich. He should be talking to people like the Barretts, father and son. He should be talking to Daniel Dumbrill. All of these YouTubers who have made videos that will give you a different side to consider. Um, so let me just say that, of course, China has a lot of issues. This is definitely like I'm also 100% against the censorship that China has, even though I can see where they're coming from, and I can take into the context, see why they're doing that, more so than just wanting power. It's more nuanced than that, which I'll get into. So I'm against that. I'm also against the lack of democracy. I'm also, and again, I can see where that's coming from, and I know the historic context of this lack of democracy and so on and so forth compared to the West, but still I'm against it. I think they should be pushing towards that direction. Maybe they are. I don't know, because again, I don't trust the Western media. And also, the third thing is that, I'm against the kind of the brutal situation that they have within, the authorities, within, you of course you could call it a police state within, but again, a lot of this is more cultural than just the CCP. Um, from I think China, I think what people don't realize is that China actually has been moving towards a more free society than they've ever had been. So this is why I find it really silly for Sargon to say things like, "Oh, China is evolving into a fascist state." And I'm just like, "What are you talking about?" I mean, I guess if you're saying that China is evolving from anarchy to a fascist state, I guess you could kind of say that, but this is just a ridiculous argument to make, because during anarchy, I mean, there wasn't a unified authority as much, but there were local fascists. Well, I mean, I don't know if you call them fascists. Maybe it's even worse than that. There were local warlords who were, really, really oppressing people, and were violent towards them. And I can even tell you my personal experience just 20 years ago when I was still living in China. I mean, compared to China's now, it's just incomparable. I can even tell you my personal stories, my personal encounterings, where there was once that I'm sorry, like my voice is cracking up. I have to speak loud because when I'm not speaking loud, uh I think like the quality of the videos just goes down, and I can speak loud now because my housemate isn't here. She's quarantined at her home. Anyways, um, so there's an incident when me and my mother were at a train station, and my mother lost the train ticket, right? So we had to go and get the train ticket. And you know what the authorities did? They literally locked us up in this jail-like place, and I was freaked out. And I was like, "Oh my God, are we in jail? What is going on?" But this is kind of how they manage to, handle it, because they need to lock people up in case people escape onto the train without a plane ticket. Of course, this is, I disagree with this, but I, I want to make you guys understand that it's kind of a way, it's kind of in a way they're forced to handle with drastic measures in order to manage a huge population. So it works in some ways. It works in, like as a startup, okay, we're doing this, and then we're gonna move on to improve this condition and this condition, this condition. This kind of thing doesn't happen anymore. It's not something, because now, they have enough technology that if you don't get on a train without a ticket, you're not gonna be on a train, But before they didn't have the technology, so they resorted to drastic actions. But now more and more China is improving. Like the police are nicer, the police are kinder, and they are less, I would say they're far less um, oppressive than they were before, and that's still nowhere near as as good as the police in Western nations, of course. Like compare Chinese police to, like, let's say the police of like Spain or UK, probably there's going to be a distance, but they are moving towards that direction. I think people don't understand the baseline where they're from is not the same as a Western baseline. So this is the first thing I want to talk about. The second thing is people need to understand that there are taboo things in the Western world too. Of course, China, I mean, it gets censored more about things, but at the same time, there are conversations you can have in a Chinese society that would not get you into trouble, such as you can talk about gender issues freely. You can talk about the issues with racial relationships. You can talk about sexual orientation, even though there are probably films and things like that that get censored because they're considered to be like pornish, because China does censor porn. This is one of the things that, because it's a conservative society, that they need to improve. But it's not just that they just censor everything. And it's also not the case that they just censor every single criticism directed at the party or the leader. It kind of depends on how you do it. And once again, I disagree with this. I'm just saying this is a more nuanced situation. Like if you do it in a more balanced manner, because there are protests in China that's never been reported on by the Western media, that protest, things like, the party isn't doing this as well, isn't doing that as well, and the party do listen to them. Like, it's not that they just don't listen to them at all regarding these issues. So again, it's not a black and white issue. And so if you're something like this, like Winnie the Pooh, and you're kind of mocking the leader, yeah, mockery, it's in China is like again, it's more cultural issue than people realize. It has to do with the fact that the Chinese Communist Party doesn't know how to handle this. They only know censorship. What they really should be doing is to follow Trump's example and respond to them. Put out something in response that's similar, but they don't know how to do it, because one of the problem with the Chinese culture is that people don't have a good sense of humor, and they don't know how to make one. They don't know how to make fun of themselves in terms of the aspect of their national identity. That's something that's really worrisome, and I think I think more and more they're doing that now, but it's still a long way to go. One of the things I really love about Americans, for example, is that Americans are really funny, because they make fun of everything virtually. Like it doesn't matter what it is, they can make fun of theirselves in terms of individuals, and they can make fun of themselves as Americans. They can make fun of themselves as Northerners or Southerners or Christians or non-Christians, whatever. I mean, and they do it in a really smart ways. This is one of the most charitable thing about America that I think people should learn from. And whereas in China, it's just they just don't know how to do it. Um, and so that's why they resort to censorship, which, of course, I disagree with. Even though, again, I kind of understand that in China, because of the history, they're really afraid of division. Like, if you look at the difference between Western news and Chinese news, there's a huge difference. In Western news, like, it's all very negative. It's all like pointing fingers, blaming people. Whereas in China, it's all about unity. It's all about, there's some good news. There's light at the end of the tunnel. People should become friends. It's kind of like that. So, and you can argue like, well, the Chinese one is like propaganda, but again, how could you argue the Western one is not propaganda? Division is a point. It is a propaganda device, to divide people and to make them against each other. And unity can be a propaganda too. But you can see that sometimes having unity is good, and other times having division is good. It's a more nuanced thing. So I just need people to put that into context. And the reason why the West has focused on division and China has focused on unity is due to its respective histories. And if Sargon wants to learn about this history, again, he should watch Nathan Rich's channel. I mean, well, it's still in progress, but again, he should have somebody onto his show and talk about China. I think he's gonna be more enlightened than he is now. Okay, so and then he talked about the social credit system. Now, ironically, the social credit system was developed, and once again, I'm not saying I agree with the social credit system. I'm just giving it more context that nobody is giving on this side of alternative media. Okay, I'm just giving the context. You can make up your own mind about the social credit system. The social credit system was developed because of the complaints from the West, mostly, actually, regarding the behaviors of Chinese visitors and tourists. And this kind of developed into the government actually putting out a brochure. I don't know if any of you guys remember this, where they say that if you're going to go overseas, you need to stop doing these things, like don't burp loudly, right? Like, don't talk loudly, like, in public places, don't spit on the ground, don't being insensitive, like pushing people. Just basically, there was a huge list, and this was heavily made fun of. But I think you should understand that this is not a CCP thing necessarily. It's just it's almost like a cultural thing of people still are not civilized enough, I should say, to the point of Westerners from these perspectives. So because once again, like, China is trying to compete with the West, they're trying to be internationalized, there has to be a force that quickly gets them onto that level. So this is the logic behind the social credit system. It's not just like as simple as CCP wants people to behave a certain way that benefits the CCP and therefore social credit system. It's not like that. The social credit system was developed in order to, you could say, engineer, but it's engineered to make people become more civilized, air quote. And you could argue, well, how can you say that? Like, it's not going to work. It's just going to be pro CCP. Okay, but we'll see. But I mean, if you talk to people, Sargon, who live in China, Westerns who live in China, they're going to tell you that the social credit system is actually working from this perspective of making people not spit on the street, for example, not pee on the street, not steal people's money, just all sort of things like that. So in a way, it seems to be working from some perspective. So it's not a black and white thing. I just want to make people understand this, and I also want people to make people understand that, like, it's not just Chinese people. Like, I tend to think like Asians in general, or at least some of these East Asian countries, I think in general they're not as civilized as Westerners when it comes to these sort of things, especially when it comes to the notion of mercy. Like that, this is a big one. Even Japan, which is supposedly the most civilized of the East Asian nations, right? I think everybody would agree with this. Even over there, 80% of the Japanese are still in support of the death penalty by hanging. Just think about that. Like let that sink in for a second. 80% of them still like, yep, death penalty totally okay. Oh, they're doing it by hanging. Well, that's fine, right? Even though like in Japan, death penalties are kind of rare, which is great, which is good, but still like 80% of people support this. Okay, like you're not gonna find that in the West, right? In the West, even the people who support the death penalty will say, well, like if lethal injection, if it's like the most benign way to die, or a headshot in the back. Actually, this is something very interesting because the shot in the back of the head is a common execution method used by the CCP actually, and the Westerners say, "Oh, that is so cruel!" Like they make them kneel and they shoot them back in the head. Actually, that is that is the quickest death you can get, and because the lethal injection, if it's done right, is the best for sure. But the lethal injection like has a lot of issues with people not doing it correctly, which will lead to long-term suffocation. This was something I heard a seminar about this. This was something of a huge concern, and this is why some, death row inmates are saying that I would like a firing squad instead of the lethal injection. But at the same time, I don't think anybody, if they had a choice, would choose hanging, because that's basically, strangulation. People say, well, if you have a long enough drop, the neck is gonna snap, but it kind of depends on how much you weigh. And really, they're not going to, if you're really light, they're not gonna throw you like a 5-story building. That's just not gonna happen. So you're just gonna be strangled to death. And this is the execution method in even Japan. Not to mention the rest of Asia, for crying out loud. Oh, Jesus fucking Christ. People need to understand this. And this is also why, like, when I saw the Hong Kong protests, I was thinking to myself, I was like, if this thing doesn't become violent, I'll be shocked. And guess what happened? It became violent. And all the evidence actually points to that the violence was started by the protesters. There's we don't exactly know what happened 100%, but there's much more evidence that shows that it was a protester who started to become violent towards civilians and also towards other protesters who don't 100% agree with them before the police decided to control it, and that was where the clash happened. So again, there's just kind of a cultural issue that that if the CCP doesn't step in, it will be much slower in development. But right now, what the Western media and the Western establishment, their number one concern obviously is not the civilization of China, right? Like it's not civilizing Chinese people. It is to make sure that the competition is being squashed, because they're just afraid of the competition. I think it just weirded me out that Sargon doesn't understand this. Now, I'm not saying though that the West shouldn't defend itself against Chinese competition. By all means, do, but understand that it is a competition, And I don't care if it's China or if it's Russia or if it's someone else. I do not want monopoly anywhere. I prefer that there is a competition and none. It just seems like China is the country that that is most likely to be a major competitor to the West than anywhere else, even Russia. So, okay, it's China, but it doesn't have to be. I want to emphasize that. So this is also another thing that I want to bring up. And also, I think people don't realize is that a lot of Chinese voices that are just not being heard. This is something very sad, because there are people that if you listen to, they're very enlightening. Like, for example, there was an interview, and this is not translated, and Western media would never translate, of course, regarding the pollution problem, from China. And this was a scientist from the National Science Foundation in China, I guess. And he was interviewed by this lady who's actually, like pro-Western, right? So she wants to put him on the spot. And he said many things that, again, Western media would never report on, such as the context of development. So he's saying that, well, sure, China has a big pollution problem, but the issue is that the West, when they were having the pollution issue, they were earlier, and they managed to develop their country using all this technology that would cause pollution, and now they stopped developing, they leveled off. But China is now only started developing, and they're pointing the finger to China regarding the pollution problem when they don't have to deal with the problem of development nearly as much as China. And in the end, like the interviewer says, so what is your solution? And he says something just absolutely profound. He said, well, it's the only solution is for everybody to become civilized. This is something, it was so profound. He understands the situation is regarding the progress civilization that China is trying to catch up hundreds of years behind the West. And it just saddens me that somebody like Sargon just won't sympathize with this fact. Like, he constantly compares Western countries with like China or with other places, and he somehow thinks that this country should just match up Western countries, even though the histories are different, even though like there's so many factors that are complex that you need to take into consideration why that is, right? I mean, just like thinking about let's say a country's dominating a sport, let's say is marathon, and this other country, obviously were denied and didn't develop on their own, let's say certain techniques and talents and all these things to match up, with this nation that were dominating the gold medal, right? Now imagine that's the case, and they're finally kind of starting to catch up, even though they were not only underdeveloped, but they were also crippled because, the Western nations would never talk about, the Western media, sorry, would never talk about the Western colonialism and how that fucked up China. This is a huge topic. Again, go watch Nathan Rich. He's talking about this, and the whole the whole story of how those history unfolded and how much death and it led to. Nobody would talk about that. So Western nation did also fuck up China a bit, okay? And I'm not saying that they didn't bring anything positive, they did, but you have to understand that just with any nation, colonization is first to it's first to improve the conditions, it's first to gain power of the nation that's colonized other nations, first and foremost at the expense of other nations. This is why, for example, when Hong Kong was under the British, they weren't allowed the right to vote, and and all the administrators were assigned by the British Empire. And as soon as Britain realized they cannot hold on to Hong Kong anymore, suddenly they started to give it the voting, and then suddenly it's pressuring China for the two system. Yeah, you could say Britain did that, therefore Hong Kong is a much better situation than they would have. Sure, I'll give you that. But at the same time, you understand that they didn't do that out of goodness of their heart. They did that out of their own interest. That's the case for every nation. Okay, it's every nation that is the case. First and foremost, it's about the interest of your own nation. So when it comes to China, everything they did is about the interest of their nation. Of course, you should defend, because you should also, you shouldn't be a traitor. You should also do things in the interest of your nation. But you should understand it, and I simply don't see why you cannot do that without going on a smear lying campaign about China constantly. You can simply say, okay, here's what China is doing, here's the good things and bad thing about it, but we, the US or the UK, it doesn't matter if what they're doing is good or bad for their own country, for their own people. We need to look to our own country first and foremost. There's no reason why you can't do that, without basically lying everything about the country. And I'm not saying that the Western media, it's everything that they say is 100% lie. What I am saying is that even when they get it right, they're utilizing the wrong methods. They're absolutely utilizing the wrong methods to do it. So this is something, again, to keep in mind. Okay, so now, lastly, I want to touch upon, have I touched upon all the points that Sargon has made? Yeah, I mean, pretty much. Okay, lastly, I wanted to go over the thing that he kept talking about, the Uyghurs. So, so instead of me, well, let me give you a general kind of a understanding of the context. It's the claim by Western media is that China is committing some sort of cultural genocide, and it is they are oppressing Uyghurs because they're Uyghurs, and they're putting them into education camps because they want to xenocize, the Uyghurs, all this stuff. All of this is much more nuanced, and I would say most of this is not true. Like from what we know objectively. What we know objectively is that China has its own affirmative action, which the Western media will never report on. Via this affirmative action, as an ethnic minority, such as a Uyghur, you are allowed to be exempt from the one-child policy, and I'm pretty sure you're also allowed to exempt from the two-child policy too. As a result, this is why the ethnic minority population growth was exponential. Just look at the consensus. But of course, people are going to say, well, I don't trust Chinese consensus. But still, if you look at any consensus available, this is true. They went up like probably to twice the population growth as they were before. And this is all part of China's diversity initiative. China has its own diversity initiative that, again, the Western media will not talk about it. And they also have other things such as, just like in the Western affirmative action, you can get into better schools with lower test scores. You can get into certain jobs easier, certain industries such as the entertainment industries easier as an ethnic minority. And as a result, this is something very interesting. The number of people who are naming themselves who are registering themselves as an ethnic minority also went up exponentially. People want to say, oh, I'm an ethnic minority, even though they're probably like, what, 1/16th, ethnic minority. It's the same situation going on in the US. So this is something like you have to understand. Like, to say that China is committing cultural genocide, it's just such a huge exaggeration, if not a flat-out lie, because again, the laws say something different. So this is the first thing. The second thing is, one of the things that they are doing, and again, you don't have to agree with this, but I just wanted to give you a more nuanced point of view, is that there are thousands of terrorist attacks from 1990 all the way to 2014 in the Xinjiang region. Now, initially, what China was hoping was it would just blow over. It would just stop somehow. The police are just going to do their work and maybe it's going to stop. But it got worse and worse. Why? Because the international terrorist organization got more and more powerful, right? I mean, I'm sure people know this. People have seen what they're doing to the Western nations. So you can imagine that they're going to do something like that in Xinjiang as well. And eventually it did spill over to mainland. And that's when the Chinese government decided to do something about it. And I have a video right here that I'm going to show you with this person, Barrett, from the Barrett channel, which is one of the people I wish the Sargon would talk to. And I'll let him talk about this because he's much more eloquent than me.
And a lot of our videos recently, many people have raised the point about Xinjiang, as a lot of Westerners feel this is an issue that China sort of have to deal with. So I spent some time researching the subject, and I've took information from both the Western media and also the Chinese media. The reason I've done that is I personally feel the Western media is very biased against China. And also, I would imagine the Chinese media is kind of more biased towards China. Apart from the media, I've also spoken to a number of people who have either lived in Xinjiang or who are living in Xinjiang to get some views off those as well. So for a bit of background, between 1990 and 2016 there have been many attacks in the Xinjiang area by extremists, killing police officers and many innocent people. And these terror attacks have not just focused on one group of people. There are many ethnic minorities living in the Xinjiang area, Uyghurs being the largest amount. However, there are many others. There's many Han people living there. And these attacks have been completely indiscriminate. They've attacked Han people as well as Uyghurs, as well as other minority people in the area. The worst one of these attacks was in Urumqi, and this killed around 200 people and injured sort of 15, 1600 people. And on another occasion in Urumqi in 2014, there was a terror attack in the morning market. The extremists, the attackers, they drove a vehicle into large crowds of people, and then they set off explosives in the marketplace. Again, a number of people were killed and many were injured. In 2013 and 2014, the terror attacks spread outside of the Xinjiang area. In 2013, there was an attack in the heart of the capital of China in Beijing, where terrorists drove a vehicle through security barriers and drove it through crowds of people. A number of people were killed and many were injured. Then in 2014, an even bigger attack, extremists from the Xinjiang area attacked travellers at Kunming railway station with machetes. They sort of went on the rampage, cleavering anyone and everyone with these large machetes. In that particular attack, more than 30 people were killed and numerous people were seriously injured. And I believe this marked a turning point in the Chinese authorities and how they were going to deal with this situation. As well as these two attacks that happened in Kunming and Beijing, the authorities say there were more attacks that happened around China. But these were less reported because the authorities were nervous that it would unnerve the general public, creating panic within the general public. And I remember being in Guangzhou, and there was an incident at the railway station, and that was reported on local Guangzhou TV that extreme terrorists, again with machetes, sort of started running around again, chopping at people, attacking people with these machetes, and a number of people were also killed there, and many were also injured. So as I said, I think this really marked a turning point in the Chinese authorities' thinking, and they sort of really got to grips with they need to deal with this situation that is escalating across the Chinese mainland. When the Chinese authorities arrested and interviewed and searched these terrorists, these people who committed these terrorist acts, they found a number of material on their phones or on their computers or in their homes or on their person, which related to the East Turkestan Islamic movement. This is a movement that has been identified by the United Nations as a terrorist organization, and they have proven links to Al-Qaeda. And in fact, at a point in time, there was a number of Chinese people from Xinjiang who went to train in camps abroad, these sort of terrorist training camps, and then they returned to Xinjiang to help recruit more of these extremists, and they started sort of brainwashing some of the young people in Xinjiang into sort of extremist thinking. I believe the reason why this happened is because at the time Xinjiang was an area where there was a lot of unemployment, and many of the young people thought there was no future, no hope. So they were easily recruited by these sort of extremist recruiters, because they were promised that, if you commit actions of jihad, then you will go to paradise where you can have 70 wives, you can drink beautiful wine, you drink this wine and you will sweat perfume. These are many of the things, and because the outlook for a lot of these young people was quite bleak, they were easily drawn into this narrative. This is also, I'd just like to mention, one of the reasons why I think China banned some of the Western social media. Back in 2014, 2015, these platforms were used by these terrorist organizations to spread a lot of their videos, a lot of their propaganda. They were used to recruit young people into this extremist sort of movement and extremist thinking. And subsequently, even in many Western countries now, there's been a large sort of backlash against this, and finally the authorities in those Western countries are pressuring these tech companies to do more about removing this extreme content from these platforms. So what did Chinese authorities do about this terrorism threat? So, okay, they took a different approach to many Western countries, in that they thought the key to stopping this terrorism was to stop it at its root cause. So what they did, they really clamped down hard on security in the Xinjiang area. And they searched many people. They put security checks at railway stations, airports, public places. They stopped and searched people, and anybody that was found to have any links or any material from these extremist groups, or any communication with these extremist groups, they put them into facilities kind of like prisons. Now, I know many people in the West are referring to these as concentration camps, and Chinese authorities refer to them as sort of vocational or retraining centres. I guess my opinion is the truth is probably somewhere in the middle of those two extreme sort of descriptions of them. I suspect, although I don't have any evidence, that they're probably like prisons would be in the UK, where people are locked up and they try to re-educate them. So the Chinese authorities claim that the people in here are being re-educated. They're having the extremist thoughts sort of, rewired, let's say, to get rid of those extremist thoughts from them. They're also being taught to have skills, and so when they come out of these places, they can better integrate back into normal society. On top of this, the Chinese authorities are spending a lot on infrastructure and job creation. So when these young people come out of these camps, they see they have some sort of future for them, jobs, training, so they can do new kinds of jobs. So this is in stark contrast to what the USA and their Western allies did. The USA and Western allies' approach was to invade these countries where they believed the terrorism was coming from. But personally, I feel that the problem with doing that was that for every terrorist they killed a huge amount of innocent people. Just the invasion of Iraq by the USA and Western allies, hundreds of thousands of people were killed. And then, they went into Iraq on the premise that they had all these sort of weapons of mass destruction. And the reality of the fact that was obviously their intelligence was very incorrect, because nothing was ever found. At that time, I actually supported, the UK along with the US and other Western allies going into Iraq. But after the fact, reflecting on that now, I believe that was the wrong thing to do. And I actually feel that the actions of those Western countries at the time has actually caused a bigger terrorism problem, because the sort of wider Middle East and the situation, I think, has caused a backlash against the West for doing what they did. And over the last 4 or 5 years, you've seen a number of terrorist attacks take place, not just in the UK but in a number of European countries. This is in stark contrast to China, where since they implemented this sort of regime, this sort of method to try and combat it, there's been no terrorist attacks at all.
Okay, So I would just like to add a few things that Mr. Barrett didn't go over. Just, again, this is just to give context, okay? One is that a lot of Western media are saying that the solution to the problem with terrorism, or they like to call it uprising or freedom fighting, whatever, it's very biased, is for China to just quote unquote free Xinjiang, to give it independence. Now, in principle, this sounds like a good principle. The problem with this is that if Xinjiang becomes independent, most likely it's going to fall to ISIS. Like, this is something that people don't really consider. So even though I understand the sentiment that you don't want any country to fall under communist regime, it does not mean that um, a country that's not under communist regime is going to be better off for everybody. So this is one thing to consider. Like, where Xinjiang was going, all the evidence points to that it would become a terrorist state, just like many Muslim terrorist states around the world. And another thing people needs to consider is that once Xinjiang become a terrorist state, it will give America a reason to put its military there in confrontation with China, and it's going to incite war as a result. So this is also a very likely case. And the second thing that people need to understand is that it's not a black and white thing. It's not that China is trying to synthesize Uyghur, as it's been often said. What actually happened in actuality is that they took a look at the culture of the Uyghurs. And they kind of went like, oh, okay, the dance, the traditional dance, the traditional food, costumes, the songs and things like that, those ought to be kept. And the things that would lead to violence, those are going to be thrown out. In fact, they actually kept it more than the East Turkestan Muslim movement, because the East Turkestan movement is leaning towards more and more radical Islamic. And if you know radical Islamic, what that's like, well, women need to be covered up. Uh, Dances and many songs are banned, right? I'm sure you know the story. So it's actually because of CCP that those traditional song, dance, costumes, and a lot of the tradition are kept. So whether you agree with this or not, this is something that everybody wants, which is that, uh, when it comes to culture, right? Culture is not a black and white thing. There are things that are beautiful that emerge from a culture, and there are things that are not so beautiful. And even though people like to say this is a subjective thing, I think people think about it as being objective. At least most people do. There was even a Muslim guy in the UK. I don't remember who it was, who actually accused of the British people of being hypocrites. He was saying, oh, when it comes to like food and things like that, you just rally to our culture, but then you bash our culture. When it comes to our religion, and people kind of like, well, that's kind of it, isn't it? I mean, when it comes to things that are good, that benefits people, that are beautiful, yeah, I mean, those things we keep. And when it comes to things that are kind of ugly, those things we thrown out. That's kind of what the West did, isn't it? So in this case, it's kind of like a top-down approach that the CCP is using. You could say CCP is not in a position to do it, but still, it doesn't mean that it wouldn't work, or it wouldn't work out in the long run. So once again, it's not a matter of they are just destroying the Uyghur culture. It's more like they're picking and choosing, and it's the same with how they're dealing with Islam as well. They're literally trying to kind of almost rewriting the Quran, kind of like how Thomas Jefferson had his own version of the Bible, where they're leaving in all the peace-loving phrases, and they're getting rid of like all the phrases that are like violent and things like that. And they have people uh, who are imams who are advocating for this, who are saying things like, Islam is a religion of peace, all the stuff that we discussed. But those are the people who are serious about keeping peace. So That's why China has built a lot of mosques, and they are actively encouraging that version of Islam. So from many perspectives, yes, you can argue this is a form of control, but once again, it's more nuanced. It's not a black and white thing. So I just wanted to mention that.